Maybe I'll just take the microphone then. So I would also like to join both our host here at the library and the New Zealand mission, and thank in fact all of you for coming. This is the first ever, in many senses, this is the first time in all my life that I'm allowed to eat in a library. Isn't that also your experience? So I'd like to thank the UN Library particularly for that opportunity, but also, of course, it's a wonderful setting for this type of discussion. So we don't have so much time. I'll just mention to you what is the trigger of this particular event. And in June this year, I had the privilege of joining David and all the Pacific Islands in meetings on climate change, adaptation, disaster risk reduction, and I also had the chance to visit a few of the countries in the Pacific. And I came away, of course, always sensitized to the enormous challenges of small economies in the changing climate and annual disasters of different nature. But I also came away feeling that the countries get a little bit of a bad brief. We always talk about the climate change, but we don't give enough recognition and talk about the socio-economic challenges. You know, what do young people in the Pacific think about the future? What's the health, environmental issues? We talked with David about environmental hazards and about waste management. So I thought we'd bring these things together because next year, and that's the big event that the Pacific and the Caribbean are preparing themselves for, is the SIDS conference 2014, the World Conference, which I think I'd like to preface here, it's not a conference for small island states, about small island development states. It's a world conference about the future and sustainability of small island states and economies. So I hope that's what we will spend some time on, getting to understand more both what countries are doing. There is an enormous amount of very practical, impressive work going on among all these challenges, which also needs to be better known. The second point that I just like to make here as an opening statement is the Philippines is also a small island state. It's just that the Philippines has some very large islands as well, but it's got 7,000 islands, most of which are small. So some of the things that we've seen playing out over this past week is, of course, a parallel to what could happen in any of the countries in the Pacific, or for that matter, often happens already. So if you look at this as also an issue that is not geographically necessarily isolated, but also pertain to many of the small island countries and small islands around the world. Thirdly, the big theme for the SIDS conference next year is partnerships. There's been a very strong message from the small islands, from their intersessional conference in Barbados. If you see in the document, it's about partnerships. It's our future. We need to get donors and partners aligned behind our priorities. And I'm just looking at the international strategy and our work for the next Yoga Framework for Action iteration in March 2015. Remember the World Conference in Japan, in Sendai. And I think you already mentioned Desiree, so let me mention Desiree again. When she did some research about partnerships, she found that we had mentioned in the program for the global platform, partnership was mentioned 57 times. And in the proceedings from our previous global platform in 2011, it was mentioned 67 times. So I think if you want to look at what's the spirit and the core of how we must work for resilience and disaster risk reduction, it really is about broadest possible partnerships. So I'm very pleased with the turnout today. The Pacific, a few facts here, some impressive 800 languages. Okay, so there you are. The diversity is enormous. I think that's probably the other thing that those of us who live in this part of the world, we cannot think about small island states as one and the same. With similar profiles, it's an enormous diversity, so how to make optimum use of that diversity are maybe things that we would like our speakers to talk about. So to give an introduction to nature, geography and some of the challenges, Dr. David Shepherd is maybe known to some of you. He used to work in IUCN here some 10 years ago, then returned to his home region, the Pacific. Of course, he's Australian, and has joined SPREP, which is one of the regional institutions that are technical institutions that have been created by the Pacific leaders to support many of the environmental, climate and other challenges in the region. So we've asked David, and the fact that we organized this event with the enormous support and encouragement by the New Zealand mission was triggered by the fact that David came to Geneva. So we said, let's use this to draw attention to the Pacific, specifically the larger Pacific, including, of course, New Zealand, who has its own very recent experiences. And Ambassador Moses, who is representative of Solomon Islands in Geneva, but I've also peeked into your CV and see that you worked for the regional institutions, for UNDP, so you know everything about us. And it's one of the 2 countries from the Pacific that has a diplomatic representation in Geneva. So we're very pleased that we could get your time also for this event. So without further ado, I'd like to invite David to give an overall introduction, and after that I'd like to pass the word to Ambassador Moses to share your views, and obviously we'll give a chance to all of you to ask questions from the distinguished panelists. David.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be here. At the outset, I'd like to thank the Permanent Mission of New Zealand, UNISDR, Margarita, and also the UN Library for making this opportunity possible. As Margarita says, it's been a great pleasure to come into a library and actually eat and actually talk loudly at the same time, so I feel particularly privileged. At the outset, I'd like also to express sympathy and solidarity with the government and people of the Philippines in light of tropical cyclone Haiyan, which came through recently. So my speech, I must say, coming here I was wondering whether to give a speech or give a PowerPoint. And looking at the weather, I thought that perhaps you might appreciate some pictures from the Pacific to make you perhaps bring a little bit of warmth into the UN Library in Geneva. I'd like to introduce the Pacific context. I'd like to introduce SPREP, talk about some of the issues relating to resilience, particularly focusing on climate and disasters, and a brief conclusion. The Pacific, as Margarita mentioned, is characterised by vast distances. In fact, the Pacific is covering 34% of the Earth's surface. That's about the surface of the Moon or the land surface of Russia. It's characterised by many isolated islands, a high level of vulnerability, and in fact, in terms of institutional issues, very limited and constrained human capacity. It's big. This shows Western Europe superimposed on the Pacific. In fact, most of Western Europe would fit within the exclusive economic zone of Kiribati. So very large, which makes challenges of distance, of travel, of working as a region, particularly apparent in our region. Many islands, 30,000 islands in the Pacific, characterised by a high vulnerability to environmental disturbance and issues such as a changing climate and natural disasters. The Pacific has 3 of the 5 lowest countries on Earth. Lowest country, in fact, is the Maldives, 1.5 metres, up to about here. The Pacific has the 3 next lowest, Kiribati, Tuvalu, Republic of the Marshall Islands, from above sea level 1.8 metres to here to 2.5 metres. So incredibly vulnerable to to issues relating to a changing climate, natural disasters. Shown here is Kiribati. Shown here is one of the islands of Tuvalu. Pacific is mostly ocean, 2% land, 98% water. So by definition, many of the programs in the Pacific and those of SPREP, the Environment Program, focus on the marine, coastal and ocean issues. Very important biodiversity. I met the representative from PNG at UNCTAD just 5 minutes ago. PNG has 0.6% of the Earth's total surface, but 7% of the world's biodiversity. Very threatened biodiversity. In fact, in the Pacific region, we have, unfortunately, some of the highest rates of loss of species in the world, particularly for bird species. And finally, in the Pacific, our work as an environment program is about people and sustainable development. We don't separate our work into a neat box of environment or sustainable development. All of our work relates to livelihood, sustainable development, building on the rich tradition of human occupation in the Pacific, and noting also in the Pacific, most of the land and ocean resources are owned by communities. Very little ownership of land in government control. So programs in the Pacific have to be with and through local communities, and that's how SPREP operates. The Regional Agency for the Environment, SPREP, Secretariat Pacific Regional Environment Program, working in the region for 40 years. We work on 4 areas: biodiversity, waste management, including with partners such as the Chemical Conventions, climate change and environmental governance. Our governance is based on an annual meeting where we report to our 26 government members, which covers the 21 Pacific Island countries and territories, and what we call our metropolitan members, which are Australia, New Zealand, United States, France, and the Government of the United Kingdom. This is the ministerial meeting from 2 years ago, also in Papua New Guinea. Margarita mentioned partnerships. Partnerships was mentioned 57 times in the document, so we have 57 logos up here, just joking. But illustrating that the work of SPREP and other regional agencies such as the Pacific Island Forum, Secretariat of Pacific Community is based around working together. The challenges are too great, we have no choice but to work together to link our efforts. Our direction for SPREP is through our strategic plan. This is the cover picture. This is an traditional ocean voyaging canoe, or vaka, or vaha, depending which country you come from. Our strategic plan setting out our targets, objectives, under those 4 areas is on the website if anyone is interested. So some elements of a resilient Pacific. The IPCC, I assume everyone's aware of that, International Panel on Climate Change, their Working Group 2, released their report 3 weeks ago. It's a very long report, it's on the web, but some of the highlights for the Pacific of direct relevance are 4 scenarios outlined, which this will depend on the level of carbon emission reduction, but these scenarios predict by 2100 temperature rises up to 4.8 degrees, sea level rise up to 97 centimetres, about here. As I mentioned, some of the Pacific Islands are from here to here. Continuing and accelerating ocean acidification, which is an issue that doesn't get much coverage, but it has major implications in our region and globally, particularly in the context of impacts on coral reefs. Many more hot days, changing rainfall patterns, more intense tropical cyclones. So for us in the Pacific and all small island states and globally, these are very worrying, extremely worrying information and data and statistics. The IPCC report backs up a World Bank report called Turn Down the Heat, released 5 months ago. The impacts in the Pacific, we're well aware. The heads of government through our Pacific Island Forum meeting have identified climate change as the key issue facing the region. Our meeting in September in the Marshall Islands released the Margaro Declaration for Climate Leadership, which is also on the internet. But this is a statement outlining the urgency and the need for collaborative action to address the challenge of both climate change and natural disasters. So in the Pacific, we don't need to read the IPCC, we're aware of the issue. Our challenge is what practically do we do about it? Leaders have identified climate, natural disasters as a matter of national security, cutting across the sectors of health, agriculture, all of the social issues, health, water resources, etc. So an issue that requires cross-sectoral, integrated and effective approaches. We know in the Pacific, king tides in the Kiribati, shown here. The impacts of the loss of the coastal zone, Vanuatu, shown here. The impact of saltwater intrusion into the freshwater lenses, the source of much of the freshwater on many of the low-lying atolls in the Republic of the Marshall Islands, shown here. This is from the Solomon Islands, showing the impact of habitat, rising sea levels. And increasingly in our region, also the impact of natural disasters. This is Cyclone Evan, Samoa and Fiji, December last year. Oh, no, it's not. It should have been, but I apologise for that. This is the impacts of the tsunami in Samoa in 2009. So impacts of climate change, natural disasters are real. The Pacific countries, as for other regions, island regions, have to do something practical and tangible about that. So a lot of the Pacific approaches are based on what we call Pacific response solutions to Pacific problems. At the forum meeting in September, in the Marshall Islands, President Loic from the Republic of the Marshall Islands said, we're doing more than just standing on the shore waving our hands. So rather than waiting for the international community, we are in the Pacific. As for other regions, the Caribbean, Indian Ocean, islands are taking actions themselves. A project I'd highlight briefly is the project in the Pacific, a SPREP, UNDP, GEF, Australian aid project called Pact, Pacific Adaptation to Climate Change, looking at practical ways of adapting to a changing climate through water conservation and management. This is an innovative approach beside the airstrip in the Marshall Islands, which has been redesigned as a catchment area for water capture going to this reservoir, coupled with information, education about water conservation and use. The development of approaches to address the issue of food security in the face of a changing climate. This is Ambassador from Ontong Java in Solomon Islands, a project that's looking at developing more salt-resistant species of taro and other agricultural crops in the face of increasing inundation of the villages in the Solomon Islands. Thirdly, looking at coastal management and infrastructure, and looking at how we can, what we call climate-proof infrastructure such as roads, airports, and linking this in with national strategies. Some countries, this is Vanuatu, are looking at options for relocation of communities, often from coastal to higher areas. And increasingly in the Pacific, we're looking at how we can use what we call natural solutions, such as planting, protection of coastal mangrove forest as a frontline response to both rising sea levels and also natural disasters. And a project, a very interesting one from Solomon Islands in Choiseul, based around this approach. Just to mention briefly some other approaches, the oceans, Pacific Ocean approaches are based in the Pacific around what we call a Pacific Oceanscape Initiative, directed and led by the leaders of Pacific countries, aimed at the protection of fishery stocks and also aimed at the protection of important marine species and marine habitats. Renewable energy is a major issue in the Pacific. The Pacific contributes 0.03 of the world's greenhouse gases, but all countries in the Pacific are making major steps towards energy independence, the development of renewable energy approaches. The country of Tokelau is now 100% renewable energy. All of their energy comes from solar. Many Pacific countries have developed ambitious energy roadmaps, including Solomon Islands, PNG, and Tonga as an example. And I'd pay tribute to the government of New Zealand, which organised a renewable energy summit in Auckland, New Zealand in March this year, which provided a major stimulus to renewable energy efforts in the Pacific. Efforts such as solar energy in remote villages in Vanuatu, shown here, or biodiesel shown an example from Papua New Guinea here. I'd note that at SPREP we have a vehicle fleet of 3 vehicles, and all of these run on biodiesel from coconuts. So at the moment, touch wood, they're all still running effectively and well. In the Pacific, Margareta kindly attended a meeting in Suva in June or July this year, where we tried to look at an approach to integrate approaches to climate adaptation and disaster risk reduction. Previously, the responses to these were fragmented in different agencies, and there was very little link or integration between these approaches. But clearly in the Pacific, a combination of a changing climate and natural disasters is the major threat to livelihoods and sustainable development. Why should we have an integrated approach? Well, firstly, the leaders of all Pacific countries have told us to do that. Secondly, many of the responses to climate adaptation, I've given some examples, or disaster risk reduction are very similar. So I mentioned the climate proofing of infrastructure, design of roads so that they're more resilient to a changing climate. So is that a response to climate change, Margarita, or to natural disasters? It's the same. Limited capacity and resources in our region make the linkage of disaster approaches and climate approaches pragmatic and common sense. And clearly what we're seeing is the integration ensures opportunities and synergies from bringing these two key areas together. In the Pacific, at national levels, countries are looking at combining these key functions. So, for example, combining ministries working on climate, environment, disaster risk reduction. And there's the new ministry in the Solomon Islands, the MECDN, which is doing that. And also the development of what we call JNAPs, Joint National Action Plans. At the regional levels, we're working towards an integrated disaster risk reduction and climate change strategy. Not sure if you can see that, but there are 2 processes globally. One for disasters, the Hyogo framework, developed I think 2005 till 2015, and the climate framework through the UNFCCC and the Kyoto Protocol. Both are looking towards revision of these frameworks in 2015. In the Pacific, these are mirrored by a Pacific disaster risk reduction framework and a Pacific Island framework for climate change. These were developed in 2005, coincidentally in the same building in Papua New Guinea. Climate change framework was developed on floor 1, disaster risk reduction on floor 8, but there was no discussion between these 2 floors. So what we're doing now, as we've said at the direction of leaders, is to develop an integrated climate and disaster framework which will come into operation from 2015, which will mirror the global framework development for Hyogo 2015, and what also we are hoping for a legally binding agreement under UNFCCC from 2015. So this meeting, which Margarita very kindly participated in and very kindly said that we were perhaps showing the way to some of the other regions in these integrated approaches, has set the framework towards developing this integrated strategy, looking for the synergies and opportunities for joint approaches to climate and disaster risk reduction. Linked with this is support through SPREP, working closely with WMO, World Meteorological Organization, with national meteorological services to strengthen their role in the provision of climate information and climate services as a key element of strategy. So strategies have to be based on good information, good data, good climate service information. So the role of the Met Services is critical, and it is very important in our region to work regionally, given the limited national capacity of many of the Met Services. And also we work to support action through the UNFCCC process. I'm here because I'm travelling to Poland to the UNFCCC COP19, which is on this week and next week. Pacific Islands linking with AOSIS, the Association of Small Island States, have a clear agenda which is working towards a legally binding agreement with the best possible targets for carbon reduction, and also for the implementation of the ambitious commitments by the international community for financing of climate action in developing states, and in our case in Pacific Island countries, and specifically relating to the commitments under the Copenhagen Accord from the climate meeting 3 years ago, which committed 100 billion per year by 2020. Last slide. The Pacific is one of the most vulnerable regions on Earth to the impacts of a changing climate and natural disasters. Many innovative approaches are being developed. As I said, Pacific solutions to Pacific problems. We think there are some lessons perhaps for other regions, and we would certainly like to learn from experience globally and from other regions as well. And finally, the support of the international community is both essential and greatly appreciated. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, David. I think that was a very clear message, both about the Pacific opportunities and some of the challenges. Ambassador Moses, from your perspective, both as Solomon Island but also as a regional actor, what do you say about this theme of we are not just standing at the shore waving?
Well, thank you very much, David, for the presentation, and thank you, Margaret. And of course, I want to thank the Permanent Mission of New Zealand for the invitation, the UN Library, and of course UNISDR to come here and of course present or be able to interact with all of you, and of course David, who comes all the way from the Pacific. And I think he has covered most of the issues in terms of climate change and the impact and strategies that SPREP is providing for members of the Pacific Islands. And I think they're doing a great job, and I want to thank David and the team in SPREP for the very useful job that they are currently doing. But perhaps if you don't mind, Margaret, if I can just quickly do a presentation, and then I'll come back to the point that you raised. If perhaps it'd be good that for many people, when I came to Geneva 2 years ago, a lot of people asked me, where are you from? And I said, I am from the Solomon Islands. And then they turn around and ask, is Solomon Islands in Africa or in the Caribbean? So it was a bit of embarrassment for me. So I thought perhaps I'll just give you a quick snapshot of what the country profile is like and where we are in terms of our location in the Pacific. So that's, I think you can see that information that we are roughly about a land area in terms of square kilometers is 28,000. 1.34 million square kilometers in terms of exclusive economic zone. Population is just under 600,000. I think we were one of the highest growth rate, I think, in the region, 2.3%, and that is the biggest challenge for my country. In terms of Human Development Index, as you can see, we are ranked 142 out of 187 countries. Source of income, logging, and that is the biggest challenge for my country. Fisheries, agriculture, and of course ODA. We are, I think, one of the lowest in terms of other Pacific Island countries on GDP. And of course, 2010, we recorded one of the highest growth rate in the region. So that's just a snapshot of the country profile. And next slide. Basically, that's where Solomon Islands, in terms of other countries in the Pacific and the rest of the world, Australia, New Zealand, and Papua New Guinea. Next slide. I thought it would be useful for this presentation to give just a snapshot of some of the photos of the country after a cyclone or a natural disaster happened in the country. And that the picture you see there is one of the easternmost parts of the country, a little island called Tikopia. It's close to bordering with Vanuatu, and it's after a cyclone that really devastated that island. These are some of the photos of villages and homes that were flooded during a cyclone when sea level rise. That you can see there's a bridge that has been flooded after a recent rain this last month and has affected very badly the communication between the country and the capital of Honiara. So that's one of the reasons of why disaster is a very important issue for my country and climate change. Now, just before I touch on that, I just wanted to say that my country, in response to mitigating the impact of climate change and adaptation to climate change, we've developed a national policy on climate change. And of course, David is fully aware of this, and they have assisted us to put together this document. And this national climate change is from 2012 to 2017. And in that climate change policy, it gives a broad framework for the country to address the issue of climate change, not only at the country level, but also to respond to the country's commitment on international framework and obligations under the UNFCCC, the Kyoto Protocol, and of course the Hyogo Framework of Action. So that national policy helps to guide our own programs and work that the government is doing at the national level, but also with our partners, with other donors, with other institutions, both at the regional and international level. So that policy does help us to address some of these challenges that we face. Of course, as David has already highlighted in his presentation, the impact of climate change for small island countries like mine, And as I speak and as we talk now, many of the little islands in the Pacific, including Solomon Islands, are now going under the sea because of the impact of climate change. High level sea level rise, suffering from inundation of king tides, flooding, and of course, as you see from David Sefard's presentation earlier on, one of the low-lying atolls in the Solomon Islands, they cannot even grow their local food now because the level of salt water in the ground is really high, and therefore it kills whatever crops they plant. And it is a real challenge in terms of food security, in terms of their own survival. So it is, for us in the islands, it's no longer an issue of trying to address the impact of climate change. It's an issue of survival, whether or not we will exist. There are a lot of settlements or villages that are being displaced as a result of climate change difficulties and challenges. So this is a real challenge for us. In one of the reports that was prepared for my country, that Solomon Islands is going to experience, and it's predicted that the temperature will continue to increase and continue to rise, ranging between 4.4 to 1% degree by 2030. We will continue, it's predicted that the country will continue to experience hot and warm nights and less cooler weather. The average rainfall and seasonal rainfalls will continue to increase, and the severity of these will continue. And of course, as a result of heavy rainfall, there will be extensive flooding, which will affect, agriculture, food crops, and of course, the displacement of villages and settlements in low-lying areas. So these are indeed challenges that we're going to face and continue to face. David mentioned that the ocean will continue to experience acidification and will affect coral life, it will affect reefs, and we know very well that in our part of the world, fish and marine life is very important for sustaining food security. And once coral is affected because of acidification, we all know that we will not be able to have regeneration of marine life, and therefore will affect the level and availability of seafood and fish in those coastal areas, and therefore it will affect many of our people in terms of sustaining their food security. And a lot of our people depend on seafood for employment, for survival, for food, and for employment, and it is going to affect us as we experience climate change challenges. Next slide. Now, I just wanted to highlight here some of the challenges that we face in my country, and of course to a certain extent by other small island developing states. And I mentioned the cultural and behavioral practices. That is one of our challenges in my country. About 80% of our population live in rural areas, and they practice subsistence farming. And trying to manage how to sustain this and be able to do practices that will help reduce the impact of environment and sustaining is a challenge, and therefore we need to change that. We need to change that. Not only that, but in terms of resource management and waste management. These are issues that our people are yet to come to grips with, how to manage waste. We throw plastic here and there, we throw all sorts of rubbish here and there, we burn, and and these are the traditional practices that our people do. And in this day and age, if we're going to protect our environment, we need to address this. The other issue is education and awareness on the risk of climate change and its impact on communities. A lot of our people are still thinking that the impact of climate change will not affect them. I was in my country early this year, and it was at the time that we had a tsunami in the eastern part of the country. And there was this radio announcement telling people to move from the coastal areas to higher grounds. And people just don't care about that message, you know. They wanted to just remain where they are. So because of the lack of awareness, people do not care until the disaster strikes. So this is an important issue for many small island states and for many communities, knowing fully well what it is, you know, to do when disaster strikes. Many of us in the islands, building codes and standards is still not a problem, it's not an issue for us. We do not have building codes and standards that will help us withstand cyclones or earthquakes or whatever form of natural disaster. People build houses and wouldn't build houses to a standard where they can protect themselves from sea flooding or from earthquakes. This is an area that perhaps we can learn from others, and from other partners they can assist us develop those kind of codes and standards that will help us. And the other challenge that we face is timely access to financial resources and disbursement of those financial resources from donors and partners to enable us to implement strategies to mitigate and adapt to natural disasters. This is, I think, an issue maybe David can explain to us. How are they providing, assisting small island countries in the Pacific to access a lot of funds that have been promised by the international community for small island states. Of course, the last point I want to raise is localization of resilience at community and village level. This is an important challenge for us, and I think this is where perhaps PrEP or David might be able to highlight what are some of the strategies or assistance that PrEP can provide to small island states like mine to enable villages to adapt. We see the recent the hurricane in the Philippines, and we all know that Philippines, I think, is one of the countries that is well prepared for hurricanes and tropical cyclones. But as much as we do in trying to prepare ourselves, we can do everything that we think is best. We can adopt the best practices. But one thing we cannot do is to be prepared for a cyclone or a hurricane that is beyond the resources and limitations that we have. And therefore that is a serious challenge for many of us. Now, to conclude my brief presentation, I think for us, we need to effectively work together and to collaborate with our partners, not only with our bilateral partners and donors, but also regional and international institutions like the UN. And I think this is where we need to work together, because we can learn from each other. We can, you can assist us develop, the strategies and implement what is required for us to be able to address some of these challenges. And of course, effective resource mobilization, that is very important. And I think all of us know that without resources, especially for small island states, we will not be able to address some of these challenges that we face. And finally, effective ownership of climate change issues. I think many of us sitting around this room, we tend to have this attitude that someone else will deal with the problem, not mine. Oh, it's happening in the Pacific. I'm in Europe, I'm insulated, I won't be able to have these problems. But I think it's about time that the international community and all of us will start taking serious measures how we can contribute individually as a community to the challenges of climate change. And the time is already overdue for us to do this together. Otherwise, we will continue to experience the impact like in the Philippines recently, and it's happening everywhere. In Europe, you have flooding. In Australia, you have bushfires. You have flooding on one side of the country and bushfires on the other side. And frequent cyclones that normally don't happen all the time. It's happening every second week now, and every month in many parts of the world. So I think ownership of the challenge that we have should be priority for many of us. Thank you.
Thank you, and I think your final message here is clear. Disasters is not something that happens to someone else all the time anymore. It actually happens everywhere in our own countries. And even though your situation is maybe a bit more acute and dramatic. So Ambassador, I will come back to you before we close and ask you what the young people in Solomon Islands think. But first I will allow the audience here to ask a couple of questions to you or David. I'm sure you have some things that you would like to hear more about. Just raise a hand and stand up, introduce yourself and ask your question. Please don't make any speeches. Nobody? Yes, please. There's a mic.
My name is Yasuna Dugarova. I'm a research analyst at the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development, and I specialize in social dimensions of sustainable development. Thank you very much for the most interesting presentations, very informative, and also very provocative, thought-provocative, and also very quite moving actually as well. I actually wanted to ask, David, you mentioned in your presentation about social dimensions of sustainable development, about water, health, food security issues. But I was wondering what kind of social protection mechanism exists to protect the vulnerable populations against climate change risks, let's say in your particular country or in that region, generally speaking. Thank you.
Can we have two more questions and then we'll take all the answers? Two more, yes, please.
I'm Jason Mannion from United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. And you've already spoken about the role of donors and the role of the international community. Maybe if you could also speak a little bit about the potential role for investors in areas of sustainable development. Are there any areas where there could be incentives or where you could attract foreign direct investment to assist with sustainability? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I'm Talana Grobler from the South African Permanent Mission here in Geneva. Thank you also, as previous speakers have been saying, it was very informative, very learning experience, despite the fact that we know climate change is high on the agenda, but natural disasters or disaster management seems to me highly important as well. Just a reflection, technology in this world of unpredictability, and as the ambassadors have said, nobody can really prepare for something that is beyond a national plan of action. But can we just maybe have some ideas of the impact and the contribution that new technologies in predicting these disasters? Thank you.
Thank you. You have a gentleman. Please go ahead.
Hi. My question is around migration, and we've spoken about people being internally displaced, but with respect to cooperating with agencies such as the International Organization for Migration to facilitate migration, to what extent do you facilitate and coordinate migration in your strategy?
Good, thank you very much. So we have questions: social safety net, foreign direct investment, technology and migration. You want to start?
Perhaps I can start, and I'm sure your answers will complement and be much better than mine in any case. But social protection in the Pacific, as I've said in my presentation, the importance of the community, the family unit, is essential to mechanisms of social protection in the context of disasters, and also applicable to climate, sea level rise related issues. It's important in social protection to strengthen frameworks of support, both government and, as we heard Margareta at the June workshop, the important role of the NGO sector, such as, for example, the Red Cross after disasters. So these are the elements that are essential in enhancing and strengthening social protection in the context of climate and disasters. The private sector in the Pacific is relatively less developed, but there have been highlighted in particular opportunities through tourism development. I think the slides, which I hope have all made you feel a little bit warmer on today's cold day, give you an indication of the attractiveness of the Pacific as a destination in the context of outstanding natural but also cultural attractiveness. But also I mentioned the New Zealand supported Renewable Energy Summit, highlighted a lot of opportunities for private sector engagement in relation to renewable energy, particularly relating to new technology. The issue of technology I think is essential in the context particularly of natural disasters. So after the cyclone we had in Samoa in December last year, the use of mobile phone technology was essential. So we didn't have that when we last had a major cyclone Alpha 15 years previously. So it is important. We're aware of technology, we embrace it, we use it to help people better adapt to both changing climate and natural disasters. Migration, I should note, there is an initiative funded by the Norwegian government and the Swiss government called the Nansen Initiative, which is being implemented in 5 regions, including in the Pacific. We held a meeting in the Cook Islands 4 months ago, looking at this very sensitive topic of migration, movement of people, both within countries and between countries. The view of SPREP is that this is entirely an issue for the countries themselves. Clearly, it's the last possible option or resort, but some countries are in fact talking about it and are looking at some options for relocation, such as the government of Kiribati. But thank you for the questions, Pastor.
Yeah, thank you. Just coming back to start off with the issue of migration, I think you raised a very important point, and I think a sensitive one as well. And as David said, many of the small island states in the Pacific are now actually talking to each other about how they can move to some of the bigger islands, and are now talking to Australia and New Zealand, for instance, Tuvalu and Kiribati, how they can, move some of their people to the islands that have, are bigger. They are talking to Fiji and, of course, Australia and New Zealand. Now, in my own country, there are communities living in low-lying atolls that need to be relocated to big islands. So, again, this is, talking about moving from your own island to another island. And although you come from the same place or same island, there are differences, of course, culturally, having to adjust to a new environment, to a new place. And so these are challenges that many of our countries are facing now, and issues for governments to deal with. And I believe this is an issue that should be brought to the international level, where we can find solutions and how to address this. On the issue of social security, for us in the islands, the social safety net is the family, and of course, coming from the land is a source of security for us, and we attach a lot of, if you like, attachment to the land because you live on the land, and the family and the tribe provides that kind of social network that to support you in terms of when you face a disaster or you face challenges, and they are there to assist you. Now, in terms of the question on investment, I think that's a very important point, and that UNCTAD could play an effective role in addressing this in terms of mitigating climate change challenges. How can countries better, invest in sectors that will sustain, livelihood, employment? Many of the islands depend on tourism as a source of employment and income. How do you encourage investments or investors to invest so that they do not, when there is a cyclone or there is a disaster? And many of these tourism projects are located in coastal areas because people love the sea, love the sun, and they mainly locate their resorts on the coast. How do they, So these are areas that perhaps UNCTAD and other international agencies can assist in terms of, the kind of investment incentives and, support that they can provide. You mentioned the issue of youth, Margaret. How do our people respond, especially the young people in our country? Employment is one of the main sticking issues in my country. A lot of young people coming out of schools do not have jobs, and therefore it is a big challenge. And it doesn't help when there is a disaster, and of course the source of livelihood is destroyed, opportunities for employment are not there. So it is a challenge for not only my country, but a lot of other small island states in the Pacific.
Good. Thank you very much, Ambassador. So already in a very brief session, some very significant things have been raised, and particularly, and many of you are aware of also that ISDR, in anticipation of the new Yoga Framework for Action, we've invested quite a lot in mobilizing the private sector and industry for the resilience of investments, for responsible engagement by the private sector for their own sake, but also for the environment in which, of course, they are going to act. And there's a whole depth of already good knowledge about, in fact, how little the private sector has seen disasters as a risk. So maybe one of the big leaps of change behavior would be also the private sector seeing disasters as a business risk, not just other types of risk, which I'm sure they are planning for with much more engagement. Some progress is being made. The other point, I don't know if any one of you picked that up, Ambassador Moses mentioned early warnings that no one heeds, which also relates to the question about technology as a help or in fact as a hindrance, sometimes an over-reliance on technology. But this issue that the end of the chain of the early warning system, which is the people, is the real challenge. The technology is fine. We can get satellite information, it can be downloaded, it's beamed out through radios and TVs, and then people start taking their own decisions. Which is, oh no, last time nothing happened, this time I won't move, or nothing will happen, or things. It kills people all the time. And I don't think the challenge here, of course, is technology. The challenge is, and you mentioned it really, education, public awareness. Can that be done in such a way so that people trust and engage with the early warning systems that every country is investing in today? But early warning is just part technology, is also people. The migration, I think that was good, it came up. It's both migration inside countries, which poses its own challenges, but of course also migration into other countries. And I had the pleasure of being in a lunch with heads of states and governments of small island states in September in New York, where the president of Kiribati, a well-known personality, stood up and said, you know, I don't give a bit about whether it's climate change or disasters. We just need to deal with the issues. So please don't get me involved in endless discussions about the causes. Let's deal with the consequences. Very passionate. You know what the reality behind that is now. You've learned a lot about that, I think, in this short hour. I think we have to close our session. I'm afraid, is there a last question? Something that will help us to stay in touch? Please, sir. Do we have one more mic?
If there is no mic, I can do analysis of that of the Secretariat of the Basel Project and Stockholm. I see we all know about the problems facing the island, it's climate change, the possibility of disasters. But I see one issue that both the Ambassador and David mentioned is the waste management. Here in Europe, you can manage the use of oils from one country to the other, but you have cars, trucks, and that is the ocean, the costing of that. Maybe David can illustrate the colleagues about the waste management in the region. Thank you.
Waste management is a critical issue. So we saw in Niue, for example, where most of the houses are made of asbestos after Cyclone Heighten. This caused a major waste and health problem as just one example. So this issue of waste has to be considered in the context of natural disasters and climate change. I could talk much longer, but I think I should stop there. Thanks, John. Good comment, thank you.
Final word from Ambassador? No?
No, I don't know.
From New Zealand? So let me thank New Zealand, David and Ambassador Moses for joining us for this all too short session. Me personally also would have liked to continue, but let's just say keep your interest up for the medium-term challenges of small island states, both in the Pacific, Caribbean and in the Indian Ocean. And include New Zealand, because New Zealand is also part of the challenges of climate change, although you very modestly today decided not to put that forward. So thank you all for joining us, and I hope the UN Library, thank you to all the staff here, to the staff of ISDR and the New Zealand mission who have organized this. Please let us back into your library again. It's a very nice place to be in. Thank you so much.